Good evening. Thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedule to join us. I think we've got a really special evening and conversation ahead. Um, Before I introduce tonight's guest, Christopher Preston, I want to make a few brief announcements and acknowledgments. And I think I'll start with a land acknowledgement. Um, I am joining you. I'm in Seattle from the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people who have lived and stewarded this area since time immemorial. We're all joining this conversation from different places. We all live and work in traditional lands of indigenous communities, and I want to encourage you, if you've not already done so, to learn about your local indigenous communities and explore ways that you can support and partner with them in pursuit of shared goals like clean waters and healthy lands, fish and wildlife populations, and healthy peoples and communities. So this is the first of three webinars this fall that Save Our Wild Salmon is co-hosting. It's part of our 2025 Reciprocity series. We had three in the spring, and now we've got three this fall. This is the first. And this fall series is going to feature, three special, thoughtful, provocative, and hopeful thinkers and writers. We're spending this evening with author Christopher Preston, and we have two more webinars scheduled for this year in October with the former Seattle Times reporter and author Linda Mapes. She'll be talking about her new books, The Trees Are Speaking. And then former Washington State Poet Laureate Rena Priest, who's a Lummi tribal member, lives in Northwest Washington State, and she'll be reading from and speaking on her new book, Positively Uncivilized. Next, I just want to say that Save Our Wild Salmon is proud to be co-hosting this particular webinar with the Sierra Club, and I want to introduce Margie Van Cleve, a longtime Sierra Club volunteer in Washington State, to join for a moment and help kick the evening off. Margie?
Thanks, Joseph. Thank you all for attending tonight's webinar. My name is Margie Van Cleve. I'm the Conservation Chair for the Washington State chapter of the Sierra Club. I'm zooming in from Missoula on the dry side of Washington State. So the Sierra Club in Washington and throughout the Northwest and Alaska, we have strong engagement on salmon and orca work, where we work with our Save Our Wild Salmon partners and others, as well as grizzly recovery. Our wildlands, our wildlife, and our rivers are the heart of the Sierra Club work. I'm reminded of that after spending time around the brown bears of Lake Clark National Park and the Tongass National Forest, as well as the humpbacks of Icy Strait over the last 2 summers. The Sierra Club is very happy to be co-sponsoring this webinar with Christopher Preston and Save Our Wild Salmon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Margie. Sierra Club and Save Our Wild Salmon have a long partnership going back quite a few decades in the Northwest, and we're excited to be co-hosting with you. I also want to add that this year's Reciprocity webinar series has been sponsored with generous support from the Natural Encounters Conservation Fund. I want to just acknowledge and thank them publicly for their strong support this year. It's been greatly appreciated and helped make this webinar possible. So before I introduce Christopher, I want to just review the program for this evening. In a moment, I'll introduce Christopher Preston, who will talk about his book, Tenacious Beasts. Christopher and I will chat after his presentation for a couple of minutes, and then we'll open up the conversation for question and answer with you, our audience. And then finally, before we adjourn, I just want to plant seeds right now that we'd love to ask you to take action in two specific ways this evening before signing off. One is to sign a petition for an action that's sort of current now in the Pacific Northwest. And also to invite you to join our next virtual action hour coming up soon to learn more about our work and how you can help and advocate for wild salmon and steelhead and their rivers and streams. Without further ado, I'll just say it's a great honor to welcome and introduce our special guest, Christopher Preston. Christopher is a professor at the University of Montana. He is an award-winning author, environmental philosopher, public speaker, and clean energy enthusiast based in Missoula, Montana. Some quick background on him. I think he'll probably take a few minutes and provide some additional details. He grew up in England and moved to the United States in his 20s to pursue a graduate degree. He landed in Colorado and spent some time there, but was soon drawn to Alaska and I think the big wild landscapes and rich wildlife populations that are there. He spent a lot of time in and around the Pacific Northwest. As I said, he lives in Montana. And he's immersed himself in salmon and salmon fishing in Alaska, and we especially like that about him. His writings have appeared in many places: The Atlantic, Smithsonian, Discover, Orion, Slate, The Wall Street Journal, The Conversation, Salon, the BBC, Yale, E360, and other outlets. His books and journals explore wildlife, climate change, justice, technology, and other topics that bear on how we as humans live here on Earth and manage ourselves. His most recent book, Tenacious Beasts, won the 2024 High Plains Book Award for nonfiction and was included in the New Yorker's Best Books of 2023. I was introduced to this book by my sister about a year ago. She lives in the Basque Country in northern Spain. She's been there for many decades and has been active there in rewilding efforts in her area, a movement that Christopher will talk about that's growing in Europe, North America, and other places around the world. I read the book. I was inspired by it. We are living in such a challenging time. And here comes Tenacious Beasts, a book that, while not papering over the very real and pressing challenges before us in so many species today, offers some hope around restoration and recovery and resilience, and suggests some ways that we humans can and should learn in order to better manage ourselves, including offering back some space for the other critters with whom we share this beautiful planet, which we have too often thoughtlessly and selfishly pushed aside. So, Christopher, thank you for being with us tonight. Looking forward to your presentation and the discussion afterwards. Welcome.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you for the kind introduction, and I appreciate everybody showing up here this evening. It's good to be here and good to be connecting to the Pacific Northwest. As Joseph suggested, this book is a jolt of optimism. My goal, I think, is to have you leave here tonight feeling just a little bit better about the natural world. I wrote a book before this one. It was called The Synthetic Age, and you might imagine it was about the replacement of nature with synthetic things. And so that was kind of a grim book. But this is an uplifting book about animal recoveries. And the first recovery I want to talk about is one that took place about as far away from where we are right now as I got in the writing of this book. But it involves a very familiar animal. So I'm just going to read one paragraph from Tenacious Beasts. Standing on the dock in the dead of Arctic winter, Sven-Anders closed his eyes to the northern lights above. All the professor wanted to do right now was listen. As the mountains and green aurora faded from his retina, the sound of a gently rippling ocean washed over his body. Seconds after his mind quieted, he heard the splash of a large object, followed by a fierce exhalation of air. Then he heard another, then another. A fishy scent wafted shorewards. Casting his head back to the sky, Sven-Anders' mouth cracked open as he drank in the frigid nighttime air. He was perched on the doorstep of whales, dozens and dozens of whales, humpback and killer whales, drawn to Norway's Kald Fjord in the winter months to feast on herring. So I put these stories first because the humpback, I think, is a classic example of a tenacious beast. So I have to define my terms, right? A tenacious beast is an animal that has gone to the verge of extinction and teetered on that verge. And then something turns around for it. Maybe a law changes, an attitude changes, some kind of weird happenstance of chance, and the animal starts coming back. And humpback whales are a real good example of that. So the population of humpbacks that I was reading to you about there is the North Atlantic population of humpbacks. And those have risen in the last 50 years from about 1,000 to about 35,000. Closer to us in the North Pacific, that population of humpbacks has gone up from about 1,200 to 24,000. And the most spectacular recovery is in the Western Indian Ocean, where humpback populations have gone from about 600 to 30,000. So this is an incredible good news wildlife story. I have a friend in Norway who told me that her tradition was to sleep every night of the year, kind of a weird Arctic thing, I think, every night of the year with the window open. But when the whales were in, she couldn't leave her window open because she couldn't get to sleep. How lucky you must be to have your dreams disturbed by whales. So a whale is an example of a tenacious beast. Now, there's plenty of bad news out there. And by telling you optimistic stories, I don't want to paper over the bad news. There's 1 million species threatened with extinction. Vertebrate abundance is down about 70% since 1970. Freshwater migratory fish are down 81%. And those massive salmon runs on the Columbia, for example, down from about 16 million to about 2 million today. So there's plenty of bad news out there. But I think there's a double-edged sword, which is what I want us to be thinking about tonight. Double-edged sword is, yes, these animals, these species are easy to destroy, but some of them have a spectacular capacity to recover. So I went looking for these recovery stories, and I grouped them in the book according to 5 landscapes. So on farmland, and this was farmland in Europe, I talked about the red deer, I talked about the Eurasian wolf, I also talked a little bit about the wild boar. On prairie, out here in Montana, I talked about plains bison, I talked about pronghorn, and a little bit about swift fox. On rivers, I talked about beavers, and on those rivers that are being restored, I talked about salmon recovery. In forests, I talked about a very rare bear called a Marsican brown bear in the Apennines of Italy, and I talked about a couple of owl species. And in oceans, I talked about those humpbacks that I mentioned, I talked about sea otters and sperm whales. Once you tune into the idea that some animals are recovering, it's amazing how many good news stories you find. And I would challenge you, after you listen to me tonight, to just kind of keep your ears open in the news and see when those good news stories crop up. They crop up surprisingly often. And same also in rivers. A staggering example is the Kennebec River in Maine, where a couple of dams came out a decade or two ago, and the alewives have come back from tens of thousands to millions. There's estimated to be 3 to 5 million alewives on the Kennebec now, up from maybe 10, 15,000. And those Atlantic sturgeon, those dinosaur fish, after a harvest moratorium in the late 90s, a little bit of habitat restoration, those dams, we're not sure exactly what they're at now, but it's thought they've increased from 5,000 to about 10,000. So you get these recoveries on rivers. In the Elwha, the coho salmon fishery, as you know, has restarted for the tribe for ceremonial and subsistence purposes. There's thought to be about 7,000 coho returning to the Elwha today. So of these recoveries, fish can be spectacular because they're so prolific, they're so fecund. So a sturgeon can lay 4 million eggs, a Chinook salmon can lay 10,000, the striped bass, hundreds of thousands. So there is this good news out there. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, all right, don't be too optimistic. Don't cherry pick the stories and paint a world that isn't the world that exists. And again, I want to accept that there's a lot of things to be concerned about environmentally, but there's reason to tell these good stories. And these reasons include hope. So I teach undergraduate students about environment and climate. And for a while, I thought my job was to tell them how bad things were. And I've realized now that that doesn't do anything for them. They need hope. They need a picture of what a future could be. They need something they can visualize and feel that it's a better world, and that will motivate them to act. So I think spreading a bit of hope is a good idea. I think reminding ourselves of how biology works is also a good idea. There's a sense in which if you make the right moves, if you do the right things, if you relieve the right pressures, animals can bounce back. And we saw this during COVID, right? We all disappeared, retreated into our homes, and animals stepped into that space that we retreated from. And the third reason I wrote the book, so I am a philosopher by trade. That's what I teach at the university. The third reason was to uncover new ways of thinking about animals. And the idea here is when an animal goes close to extinction a century ago, or 50 years ago, or 250 years ago, the stories that you're left with are the stories that people were telling when that animal got depleted. And here we are a century or more later, and we have different science. We have different knowledge about cohabitation. We actually have a different public with different interests. And so we should give these animals a second chance, give them a second chance to think about them differently, to think about them as 21st century beings, instead of thinking about them as 19th century or 16th century beings. So that's a little sort of overview of what I was trying to get at the book. You might be wondering, what did I learn? And my goal, I'm a sort of synthetic thinker. I wanted to bring things together and come up with some simple principles for animal recoveries. Of course, that was not possible. It turns out that every recovery is a little bit different. You have to improvise. You have to be pragmatic. But I did learn a couple of things. And the one I learned that I think took the most, let's say, background research, the most detailed conversations, the most sort of PhD level interactions with biologists and specialists was this. If you want an animal to recover, you've got to stop killing it. You've got to stop killing it. And when you do, that animal comes back. So that's true for the humpback whale. It's also true for the bison. It's true for the beaver. It's true for the wolf. You simply have to stop killing it. So I was being a little facetious there, saying it required a lot of sophisticated thought to get there. It's pretty basic, but it remains pretty true. So that's the case with those 4 recoveries. Others are a little bit more complicated. So here we are in Italy, and I mentioned that Apennine brown bear, the Marsican brown bear. And what these volunteers are doing is they're pruning apple trees. They're pruning apple trees because these apple trees are out of town. And if you can put fruit on those trees out of town, the bears are going to eat that fruit and not come into town where they get in trouble. This was a little bit of an odd idea for me. Here in Missoula, Montana, we take the apples off the trees to provide a disincentive for bears. But there in the Apennines, they're trying to encourage apples on the trees to provide some incentive. But it's really strategic. It's about where you want the bears to be. These are abandoned apple orchards that are in the foothills. And they're better having the bears in the foothills than having them in town. I would have loved to have seen a Marsican brown bear. For about a century, there were only 50 of them. This was one of the smallest populations of brown bears left. The only smaller population is the Gobi Desert brown bear. But these Marsican brown bears were at about 50. They're now thought to be at about 60 or 70. So they're kind of inching their way back. And it's thanks to some really good work by the people at Rewilding Apennines and Salviamo Lorso. And I hung out with a couple of them when I was over there. One of them is called Mario Cipollone, a wonderful guy. The bears are his heart and soul. He really is, he lives this cause. And we walked around the hills there through the forests. The bears live in these oak beech forests and they eat acorns and nuts. And that's what makes them distinctive. Their jaw has evolved a particular shape to deal with those acorns and nuts. So we traipsed around. Mario showed me some trail cams where he'd had pictures of the bears. He showed me these apple trees. He showed me places where he's encountered bears. The closest I got was some Marsican bear poop. We were hiking through the woods, and there in the middle of the trail, on top of the leaves, was this bear poop. And it was exciting. I got to say, it was incredibly exciting. These mythical bears, knowing that one had passed by recently. So Mario said, yeah, look at the berries. You can see it's been eating berries. And its digestive system isn't that strong. So a lot of the fruit remains intact as it passes through the gut. Then the next thing he did is he picked up a couple of sticks and used them to bring the poop up off the ground towards his nose. This was a slightly worrying moment. I didn't really know what was going to happen next. But he closed his eyes and took a deep breath in. He inhaled the smell from the poop. And then he opened his eyes and he said, "Is like a fine wine." And he was so chuffed, so excited to be inhaling that aroma. You know, the Italians and their food. It just, for me, it like flicked a switch that this is a cultural moment for him. This is important to him as a people. And he said, as far as I'm concerned, if the bear disappears, we disappear as a culture. So I'll tell you the story about the bear because it's the opposite of the humpback whale. You don't just leave it alone and it comes back. You got to work hard. You got to figure out how to encourage the survival of these bears. There's another example where you got to work hard. The northern spotted owl, which, as you know, is getting hammered right now. It was getting hammered by habitat depletion, but it's now getting hammered by barred owls. You can save northern spotted owls, but you have to do it by shooting barred owls. And I went out on the forest with a technician who was running an experiment to see if shooting the barred owls would work. Turns out it does work. And at the end of that experiment, they made a recommendation to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to suppress those barred owls so that those northern spotted owls can survive. Now, that's extremely controversial. There's been a pretty heavy pushback against that because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service adopted that recommendation and said they would, over the next 3 decades, kill up to 500,000 barred owls. It's not clear if that's going to happen. But I use this as an illustration because this is the extreme end of how to help an animal come back. Not just leaving it be, not just being clever about giving it enough food, but killing its competitors. And of course, that's not the only place we do that. In the Columbia River, we do that to help protect salmon. The state of Oregon, the state of Washington get permits to kill Steller sea lions. So the stories themselves don't give any clear picture as to how to best bring a species back. But I have come up with 3 principles, and this is really kind of the meat and potatoes of my presentation here. 3 basic principles which I think work to help these animals recover. And so the first principle is this: they must live. So this is sort of a riff on stop killing them, right? They must live. So here's a sperm whale tangled in ropes. If whales die, if endangered whale populations are hit by these incremental losses, and the whale population that is particularly relevant when we're talking about entanglement here is the North Atlantic right whale. So the North Atlantic right whale, there's about 370 left. 70 of those are reproductive age females. Because of the stressors on the population, those reproductive age females, instead of giving birth every 2 to 3 years, are giving birth about every 7 years. So the 70 reproductive females giving birth about every 7 years, that means at any one time, there's probably around 10 pregnant females. And if you're entangling one of those a year, and if you're hitting another one with a ship and killing it with a ship, then that population is going to really struggle. They must live. Every one of those North Atlantic right whales must live. You can change your species and you can come up with the same principle. If it's wolverine, there might be 300 wolverine in the lower 48. So every one that ends up in a trap or every one that gets hit by a vehicle is a serious impact on that population. These animals must live. Now, I'm obviously here saying stop killing them. But I'm saying something else as well. They know how to survive. They know how to live. That's how evolution works, is it fine-tunes an animal to be a survivor. It fine-tunes it to live successfully in an environment. And so if we can just take our foot off their back, if we can just give them that space to breathe, they know what to do. So stopping killing them is really a way of honoring the evolutionary process, the evolutionary system. They know what to do. We've just got to let them do it. There's another thing I want to say, another sort of wrinkle to the they must live principle. When we bring it down to the level of individuals, when we bring it down to that one North Atlantic right whale or this one wolverine, we're inviting compassion. We're inviting to see these animals as individuals and to change our behavior on the basis of that compassion. And so they must live is really a statement about how we should be around animals, what sort of attitude we should have. And I think compassion is an attitude which doesn't always get first billing in conservation, but I think it has a place. And so what that means is if you keep honey and bees, for example, fence it so that you don't attract animals like bears. If you live on the shore, and there's shorebirds nesting on that shore, keep your dog on a leash. Don't let that dog trample over those nests or crush those eggs. If you've got culverts without access, make access. Let every fish make its way through that culvert. If you can restore a little bit of habitat with a beaver dam analog, with planting some willow whips, do it. Every single patch of landscape, every single animal you can save is a good idea. So they must live, is my first principle. My second is they must roam. So this is an animal overpass on Highway 93, about 30 miles from where I sit right now. It's on the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes Reservation. And overpasses, if they're positioned in the right place, can be unbelievably successful in stopping animals getting hit by vehicles. In a perfect situation, they can reduce impacts with cars 80 to 90%. And the tribe up here just north of me, when Department of Transportation went to them and said, we need to expand that road, can you let us do it? They said, you can do it if you recognize that the road is a visitor to this landscape, and we need to adapt the road so that we're providing passage for those animals. So this is currently the only overpass in the state of Montana. We have about 122 highway crossings. Most of them are underpasses. The tribe has got funding in 2023 to build a second overpass. So on this one reservation, there's going to be 2 wildlife overpasses within about 20 miles of each other. Take this they must roam principle into a river, and you've got dam removal. So that's the Copco Dam on the Klamath River. $450 million, but paid by dam operators and a 2014 state of California bond measure. One of the interesting things about dam removals is quite often, in the right circumstance, the owner of the dam wants it gone because maybe it's not providing the service that it was providing 75 years ago. Maybe upkeep has become really expensive. Wildlife regulations have tightened up. And so these dams need more modifications in order to pass regulatory muster. And so often it's a win-win. The owner wants the dam gone, and the dam goes, and habitat is opened up again for fish. That's true here on the Elwha, which I visited, and those coho that I was mentioning earlier on are starting to head up past the dam. That's the Glines Canyon Dam that came out in 2014. These are obviously big infrastructure projects. But highway crossings don't have to be purpose-built, expensive infrastructure. Here's a highway crossing. That's I-90, and it's just the bridge where I-90 crosses the Clark Fork River. But there is a little triangle in the corner that could be an effective highway crossing. It could be especially effective because a conservation organization called Vital Ground bought up this cottonwood gallery to the north of that crossing. And so they're managing that cottonwood gallery to make it an effective entryway to that passage underneath I-90. So it involves infrastructure, but in this case, it doesn't involve building a whole lot of infrastructure. It involves strategic purchasing of land so that they can roam. I was in Scotland this time last year, and here we are in a piece of classic Scottish landscape. This is the Allerdale Wilderness Reserve, which is north of Aberdeen. And when I was a kid, I would look at that and I would say, Scotland, it's so gorgeous. But knowing a little bit more now about the ecology, that's an ecological desert. That should not look like that. It looks like that because of overgrazing by sheep, and more recently, when there's less sheep, overgrazing by red deer. What that should look like is a little more like this, where you have the Caledonian pine, Scots pine coming back. You have willows, you have blaeberry, you have birches. You should have a mixed forest rising out of those valley bottoms. And when you have that, you have the possibility of passage of animals like this, the Scottish wildcat. It looks really fierce, right? But it's actually the size of a tabby cat. They're trying to get these wildcats back first. And then when that furor has died down and people are used to them, they're going to try and bring lynx back onto those landscapes. Lynx at the moment are still a tough sell, but I think that time will come eventually. So in this case, there's no infrastructure being built, but there's habitat being restored. And that's on a grand scale, if I'm talking about the Caledonian forest. We can take it down to a smaller scale for some animals. So this is a red squirrel, and still in Scotland, this guy, whose name was in fact Hamish, which is a good Scottish name, was pointing to the edge of this field that he owned, and he was going to plant a strip of Scots pines up the edge of that field so that the red squirrels could make it from the valley bottom, where they were known to be, up into that wood that you can see behind our heads there in the background. So he was literally planting 6 or 7 pines up this fence line in order to provide the connectivity for that red squirrel. They must roam. They must roam. This is just the truth of ecology. An animal has to find itself a niche. If one niche dries up, it has to move somewhere else. Obviously, with climate change upon us, animals need to be able to move. And so they must be able to roam. I would argue they don't need half the earth. E.O. Wilson's famous dictum that half the earth should be left to animals. I think if you plan strategically and if you connect habitats, they can get away with less than half the earth. I don't think it's likely that they're going to get half the earth, frankly, given how much humans dominate. But if we allow them to roam, if we allow them to explore, then we provide the possibility that they can survive and do well. And there's some wonderful graphics available about the way animals that move stitch the world together. So if you go onto the Audubon website and look at these explorer graphics, you can see on the left those yellow dots. Those are individually collared birds with radio transmitters. And Audubon has a set of graphics for a bunch of different species showing the migrations of these birds, these tens of thousands of mile migrations. And if you look at the map on the right there, they're binding North America together, and they're binding it to South America. So this is astonishing science that's finally giving us an insight into how these birds move. There's places in Pennsylvania where 1 million birds an hour are moving overhead in the darkness, stitching the earth together. Take that thought to the oceans, and these are the migrations of whales. And so think about how whales bind the ocean together, how they make it one planet. The movement of animals puts us on this singular planet, connected by their beating hearts. And we can take that to fisheries as well. And so here's a map of the Pacific Northwest. Look how those rivers and those tributaries, look how they are capillaries for that landscape, how they are a lifeblood to it, making all of life possible, binding it together. And I think we've underplayed how important the movement of animals is. There's a science called zoogeochemistry. It's an emerging science, and it's about how animals move nutrients across the world and nourish the ecosystems where they leave those nutrients. Zoogeochemistry, it's an expression of the importance of the movement of animals to healthy ecosystems. So they must live and they must roam. And my third and final principle is we must change. We must change. Now, obviously, we must change to let them live and roam, right? You know, we've got to develop better habits. We've got to restore environments for them. We've got to not hit them with cars, not tangle them in ropes. So yes, at the sort of first approximation, we must change to let them live and roam. But I actually mean something a little bit deeper than that. We must change our attitudes. We must change how we think about animals. And I want to start by relating my own experience, a little bit of a sort of biographical take on this. So I think you can tell, and Joseph mentioned at the beginning, I'm from England. And I came out to the United States to go to graduate school, and I landed in Colorado, and from Colorado into Alaska. But I had to confront the idea that I was now on a landscape with big animals. And back in England growing up, the biggest animal I was going to encounter was a bunny rabbit. Well, maybe I would encounter a fox. And it wasn't impossible that I would see a badger, but I never saw a living badger. I only saw badgers dead on the side of the road. So rabbit, fox, maybe badger, that was all I would encounter. I would encounter nothing like a brown bear. So this picture was taken in my hometown of Missoula in 2022. And this brown bear is looking mighty relaxed, and it's in a Norway maple tree. Those of you who know your trees will know that Norway maples are not a native tree species in Montana. It's a street tree. And it'll become clear that this is a street tree when we see the next picture taken a couple of minutes later, where that black bear climbed out of the tree and actually walked across onto campus. You can see a student in the background there walking towards class, and that bear was just going to check out campus, I guess. This particular fall, so this was the beginning of the fall semester, it was a year where the huckleberry crop had failed up in the mountains, and the bears had all poured into town. And it was thought that there were between 150 and 200 black bears in town that fall. If this has been my first day in the United States and I saw this bear walking onto campus, I would have swiftly applied for another job somewhere else or moved out of town, because I was so unfamiliar with this idea of bears hanging out in town. But these 150 to 200 bears that were in Missoula for a month in September of 2022, they did not cause one injury. There was not even one negative interaction. I mean, there was lots of news about them. We were all really careful about them. We kind of, look both ways. If you walk around at night, you sort of thought about your surroundings for sure. People were very disciplined about keeping food inside. But in that month, nobody was hurt by those bears. And the following year, same thing. This is also on campus. The bears come back into town. Not as many bears in 2023 as there were in 2022. But they were in town. People like them being in town, I guess. They're safer for the bears if they're out of town, but it adds some interest to life. And those bears, again, in 2023, caused no harm to people. What I realized by then, so this is 2 to 3 decades after I first came to the United States, is that the black bear is not the animal that I thought it was. When I arrived from England, I had a perception of what a black bear was. After being closer to them for the last couple of decades, that idea of that animal has changed. Of course, I respect them, and of course, I'm careful around them. But I do not have the idea that there is a bear behind every bush waiting to jump out at me. And this was particularly poignantly revealed to me, this change in attitude, this same summer, because my wife was actually attacked and quite badly hurt by a dog that summer. And she ended up with 25 stitches. It was a pretty traumatic experience for her. But because it happened at the same time as these bears, it made me realize that I had a certain idea of bears. I had a certain idea of dogs. And those ideas needed a little bit of a revision to them. So changing how we think about animals. That's my example with bears. So that's the sort of prototype of an animal that people arrive being very scared of. But here's another way to change how we think about animals. Beavers, once known as hairy banknotes, or even pesky rodents who do damage, now known as fantastic restorationists, providing fire barriers, fish habitat, raising the water table, filtering water through their dams, adding complexity to the ecosystem. Ben Goldfarb famously said, "Let the rodent do the work." We look at beavers now as restorationists and teachers. I mean, we build beaver dam analogs to mimic beavers because we know that they can restore rivers better than we can. So how about thinking of beavers not as hairy banknotes, but as thinking of them as teachers? Thinking of them as rodents who can show us how to bring an ecosystem back. Here's some sperm whales pooping. What they're doing through that pooping is they're bringing nutrients into the ecosystem, and actually, indirectly, they're helping with the climate change problem, because those nutrients are encouraging the growth of phytoplankton. Phytoplankton absorb carbon, and that carbon enters the food chain through those phytoplankton and ends up settling on the bottom of the ocean. And so people have played around with these numbers. This is the science of zoo geochemistry that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Playing around with those numbers, it's been suggested that if we allowed the blue whale population to recover in the Antarctic, the fertilizing effect and the carbon sequestration effect will be the equivalent of growing 43,000 hectares of rainforest. So these whales, they're not just charismatic, They're not just marvelously sophisticated creatures. They're actually partners. They're actually helping with this problem that we're facing of climate change. So that's a different way to think about whales. And then let's just make a quick mention of these sockeye salmon. The amount of, we all know this story, but think about that diagram of the capillaries moving through the Pacific Northwest, those streams and tributaries in which salmon used to once hurl themselves towards reproduction at the end of their lives. That nitrogen that they're taking into that forest, that nitrogen, big fish runs can be tracked through bigger growth rings on trees in the forest in the Pacific Northwest. One black bear can bring 700 fish into the forest. 70% of the nitrogen in the coastal forest in some places comes from fish. And so there's many things we should think of when we think of salmon. And I'm not suggesting we should reduce salmon to this idea that they're just good as fertilizer and nothing else. But we can certainly think of them as essential lifeblood to the ecosystem. So they must live, they must roam, we must change. Those are my three principles that I learned from writing this book. And I want to end with one story here. It's about bears again. I indicated that I've changed my view of black bears. I'm in the process of adapting my view of grizzly bears. Grizzly bears are starting to show up around Missoula now. It does cause a little change in what I might be prepared to do, for example, when I'm biking, less inclined to bike by myself. So it does change what I do, but I'm working to think about how to live properly alongside grizzly bears. And I want to tell you a story that I heard from a friend who visited a Blackfeet tribal member with a bunch of students. And this story illustrates how far I might have to go to really change my attitude towards wildlife. So my friend was taking a dozen students to the Rocky Mountain front prior to a 5-day backpacking trip in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And on this particular day, they had their bear safety briefing before they went backpacking. So they all got told how to hang food, how to keep a clean camp, how to use bear spray. And a lot of the students that come for these field courses come from the East Coast. This is well out of their experience, well out of their comfort zone. So everybody's a little jittery. So they have that briefing. And then they have one more talk before they go into the wilderness. And they're talking with a Blackfeet tribal member. And so this tribal member tells them what it's like to live in that region, what they have to deal with in terms of the winters, bitter cold winters, what they've had to deal with historically, and what the current conditions there are. And he gets to the end of his story about living on that Rocky Mountain front. And he says, any questions? And one of the students immediately puts up their hand and says, what is it like to live amongst brown bears? I mean, there are brown bears everywhere up here. What is that like? Are you frightened of them? And the tribal member looks back at the student and says, are you asking me if we fear the brown bear? And the student says, yeah. Are you frightened of them? And the tribal member says, no. We're not frightened of them because we believe the bears protect us. So that's a changed attitude. That's a long way from the attitude I've managed with black bears even. And I'm sure I will never get there to think that way about brown bears. But we must change means being open to thinking about animals and wildlife differently. And so with that, Joseph, I'd like to invite you back and be happy to entertain some discussion and questions.
Thanks, Christopher. I just really we'll start by saying how much I enjoyed listening to you speak and you reflecting on the book and these conversations and learning and our relationship, right, with other critters. And I liked I'll just say a couple of things. I really appreciated your invocation of compassion in terms of thinking about that in our relationship with other animals. I like the agency you granted, if you will, or just recognized. It's not about you granting of animals to restore themselves. They know what they need to do. They know how to live. We've got to give them the space, the connectivity, the habitat to do so. Um, and so I have a couple of questions that build on some of the things you said. Um, you start with you in the beginning of your talk, um, you talked about these good news stories and how they came about, and you also talked, for example, your third principle is about us and how we've got to change. There's an element there that I want to sort of evoke. Maybe it's a sub of number three, which is you talked about individual actions and the ways that we can. You didn't quite say this, but it could be in our backyards. We could be putting plants in that feed birds as opposed to lawns, which don't do much of anything, sort of a biological desert. But then there's the other piece of collective action. And I want to Save Our Wild Salmon and other NGOs are working around organizing and encouraging collective action. You have experience in these different countries, which have different different governmental systems, and I'm curious if you could reflect a little bit on that element of public support in Italy, in England, in the U.S. Again, there's different systems, but my take is that the public support, these things don't come about by themselves. They come about because we change, or we're doing things, or we're bringing about change. It's scientists, it's policymakers, it's individual people, it's organizations. Curious if you could just reflect a little bit on collective action and sort of how it might have affected some of these different stories that you immersed yourself in.
I'll just explain very quickly about Europe. Brown bears, lynx, wolves, wolverines have all come back significantly in Europe. And it's in part because there was a very strong mandate from the European Union that animals whose native territory was in any of those member states should be protected. And it's sort of like it was an unequivocal, clear mandate that these animals should be allowed to live. They should be let to live. And resources were provided to, for example, put electric fences around sheep and cattle herds in Europe so that as wolves came back, people were ready for it. So that mandate, that sort of strong, clear mandate coming from central government is important. But another important element in Europe, which has helped with the wolf, is the people wanting the wolf back have put skin in the game to help the wolf come back. And what I mean by that is organizations formed in Germany, in the Netherlands, in France, where city dwellers could go out onto the landscape to help farmers protect their herds and their flocks against wolves. And that might be by banging in fence posts and hanging electric fences. It might be by camping in the sheep pastures high in the Alps in order to dissuade wolves from predating during the evening. The urban dwellers put skin in the game and put themselves at the disposal of the farmers just to let them know that they were on their side. They wanted farmers to stay on the landscape, wanted them to produce good food, and they wanted to do it in a way that wasn't economically challenging. And that kind of getting into the same space, people that too often are on the opposite sides, I think has been very effective and part of the reason why certainly wolf recovery in Europe has been spectacular.
Thanks for that. At a time of such great polarization in this country, the notion too of these different communities coming together, working together, but building relationship and knowledge about each other seems like a great byproduct, if you will. Maybe it's a central product of that kind of collaborative work. I want to touch on your story about the Blackfeet person. I don't know if there's an elder or member who gave the surprising answer to about the brown bears. I love that anecdote. And I've worked in the Northwest on salmon recovery with indigenous NGOs and tribal members, and I feel like I've heard similar kinds of stories that flip assumptions and frames that I've grown up with, that are really sort of thought-provoking, and have helped me rethink my relationship with place. Um, in your book, there are certainly, you introduce and talk about, in some instances, your interactions or the leadership of indigenous individuals or communities in bringing about these some of these changes, these recoveries. Can you just talk a little bit about, maybe reflect on some, maybe whether it's some of those stories or people, or the role that indigenous communities that are playing today in helping bring about these recoveries, and maybe also affect and influence other people's views of how we live here.
Yeah, I'll make a background comment first, and then I'll get into a specific story. But the background comment was, the slides I got to towards the end, where I said, let's think of the beaver as a teacher. Let's think of the whale as a partner. Those attitudes are indigenous attitudes through and through, and it's sort of like, to think of a whale as a partner in climate change, I had to go out with some Western scientists, and I had to study zoo geochemistry, and I had to learn about nutrient cycling and the whale pump, and and I'm like, I finally get to the end of that, after spending a lot of my mental energy, and I'm like, wow, these whales are partners. And then I think, oh, perhaps I could have learned that by listening to people who have always thought of animals as partners.
Right.
So that was a little bit salutary. But the more specific story I wanted to tell that came to mind when you were speaking there was, when I was pursuing the bison recovery stories, I had got myself very kind of hooked into this question about, if bison are going to recover, they've got to be genetically pure. We got to get the right bison, because there's about 450,000 bison in the United States right now, but over 90% of those have cattle gene introgression. They're basically part bison, part cow. And there's a small number of them that might be close to being genetically pure. And of course, people talked about the Yellowstone herd, but outside the Yellowstone herd, the Pablo Allard herd, which ended up in Canada at Elk Island National Park, and Elk Island started sending bison back down to various conservation herds in the United States, Wind Cave, for example, to the bison range in Montana. And there was this question about, are these the genetically pure bison? Are these the real bison? And I was really kind of bought into that it really mattered whether these bison were authentic, pure or not. After I finished the book, a paper came out from Texas A&M University that said even the herds that we think are pure are not. So there is no such thing as a genetically pure bison in the United States anymore. And I think there's some people who will contest that result, but one of the guys who published the paper was one of the holdouts for genetically pure bison. And he said, I wish this wasn't true. For years, I looked at the data and I was hoping that it wasn't true, but it is true. And I just have to adapt to that. I brought this concern to Terry Dahl, who Terry Dahl ran the INI initiative for the Blackfeet Nation. And the INI initiative was to recover bison on tribal lands, and eventually to have those bison move freely on the Rocky Mountain front. And I said, Terry, what about this genetic purity thing? And what about if genetic purity is not possible? And she said, I'm sick and tired of this genetic purity nonsense. That is a Western scientific construct that gets shoved down our throats all the time. And she said, we Indians have dealt with this issue of being accused of being genetically pure, genetically impure, and we don't like it. And if the bison acts like a bison, if it performs the ceremonial role that bison have always played, if it brings our communities together, then let's just call it a bison and let's just move on.
Mm-hmm.
That was, to me, that was an eye-opener. I hadn't expected that at all. But it just made me a little more self-conscious about times that I import my background and the things I've learned into contexts where, they might be really off base.
Thanks, Christopher. And I think to clarify for folks who haven't read your book or aren't sure, when you're talking the issues of purity, it's about crossover with certain domesticated cows. Is that right?
Yeah, so it would be if this contrast did exist, it would be a contrast between animals whose genetics could be traced back to historical Pleistocene bison with no introgression into the genome from cattle versus animals that are known to have cow bison mixing in their genome.
Yeah, thanks. I have one more question that I want to open up to some and ask you some questions from the audience. The title of our webinar, of course, for 2025 is reciprocity. I think you've alluded to this in your comments so far, but I want to pursue it more directly. Reciprocity is inherently about relationship, the shared responsibilities, the give and the take, could be between two people, between people in place, people in other species, all sorts of variations. I don't know if the word reciprocity shows up explicitly in your book anywhere, but I will argue that it's certainly been implied, suggested, alluded to in it. And I'm just wondering if this evening you can reflect for a moment or two on this word and the concept in relationship to your book, your work, your sort of views of that word and our relation, how it relates, how we relate to each other and the place we live in.
Yeah, I think some of those change relationships that I was alluding to towards the end of the presentation there, beavers as teachers, whales as partners, they do something for us. If we do something for them, just like kind of give them the space to survive, like prevent them getting tangled in those fishing lines, for example, or hit by ships, they do something for us. That's a reciprocal relationship. We do a little bit for them, they do a little bit for us. And so I see reciprocity in many animal recoveries. That zoo geochemistry, we let them live and they move nutrients. Shorebirds move nutrients from the oceans onto the land. So there's definitely reciprocity there. It's also there a little bit in slightly more contentious places. And when you raised the topic of compassion earlier, I wanted to kind of go there a little bit and think about compassion with fish. So I spent a lot of my life not thinking that compassion was necessary with fish. I was sort of raised with the idea that fish didn't feel pain and one didn't have to worry about fish and they just gape at you and they don't really there's no suffering there or anything like that. And then I have in my life, I've caught a lot of salmon on fishing boats. And so for a long time, I was in Prince William Sound seining for pinks. And any of those who've done it or seen it done, you get these enormous hauls of pink salmon and you roll them over into the hold where 10,000 salmon might be packed in together in this refrigerated seawater where they are slowly suffocating because there's not enough oxygen in the water for them. I mean, they're going to end up on the table anyway, but they slowly suffocate in that fish hold. I've also trolled for cohos. in Alaska, and when you're trolling for cohos, as the line comes in and you start seeing the fish on the hook, you lean over the back of the boat and you take a gaff and you gaff them in the head or the gill and you pull them up over the side of the boat. And at the time, I had no compassion. I think now about whether I could still do that. I love to eat salmon, but I would bring to that, if I was engaged in that activity, I would bring a certain compassion to it that perhaps was lacking beforehand. And I think what that compassion is, or what that compassion can be, is an expression of reciprocity, in that if I want to eat a coho, I have to recognize that as a gift, and I need to be grateful for it. And what I can maybe do in return is I can advocate for protections of coho habitat so that those cohos and their descendants have the ability to keep on returning and keep on reproducing. And so these difficult tensions, some acts of reciprocity are kind of simple, maybe don't involve tensions, but there's other acts of reciprocity that do have tension in them. The tension of killing and eating. And I think that tension can maybe, and I'd love to hear what other people say about this because I'm still struggling with this. Maybe that tension can be reciprocity if you mitigate it with genuine care and compassion for these animals.
I think it can be. I appreciate you introducing that complexity. I'm going to follow on with a question from the audience that maybe gets at this potentially a little bit, and it has to do with salmon advocates in the Northwest are working to recover abundant salmon and steelhead populations, which are central to tribal, commercial, and recreational fishers, as well as fishing guides. I think the questioner is referencing the must live piece, and maybe you've already addressed this a bit, but I want to on behalf of the questioner raise that question, that element again in the instance of fish, where fish are so central to tribal communities. I mean, in ways that are hard for us to imagine, I think, for me to imagine, but also important to commercial and recreational fisher, for culture, for food, and so forth. Of course, there are multiple sources of mortality, and fishing is a lesser among them. But is it fair to ask these parties to radically reduce harvest for a time or forever? How do we, it's the complexity I think you were just speaking to.
Yeah, I mean, it's notable that the lower Elwha Clallam tribe suspended their ceremonial and subsistence harvest for 10 years while salmon recovered on the Elwha. And that's a massive and generous position for the tribe to take. And then only in the last 2 years, when there's been enough coho returning, have they been able to begin to restore that ceremonial and subsistence fishery. And so I think we need the wisdom to know when reducing harvest is necessary, when it's appropriate, and the tribe in the case of Elwha showed the way on that.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'm right on this. There was a coho return last year of 7,000 fish, and the harvest by the lower Elwha tribe was on the order of 400 fish. So very, very modest, and very, very important, and to the tribe. A question from one is, I think it's a fairly short question, which is, where do I learn more about the bison stories that you were telling, the bison recovery that you were referencing? Do you have suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, two good places. Well, mine are a little Montana. My recommendation is Montana based. But what used to be called the National Bison Range was given back to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes about 3 or 4 years ago. It was one of those riders tacked onto a budget bill. It was something that the tribe had waited a long time for. And they have, I've been taking students up there for the last decade or so, and since that place became tribally run and managed, it's become incredible. I mean, the visitor center is amazing. The interpretive material is astonishing. So if you're talking about visiting a particular site, the Bison Range in the Flathead Valley, or American Prairie out in eastern Montana. American Prairie is trying a new model of conservation, a private philanthropic-based model of conservation, where American Prairie buys up ranches from willing sellers and gradually takes down fences and changes over the permits from cattle grazing to bison grazing. And they recently built a discovery center in Lewistown in Montana. And that's a fantastic place to go visit as well. But the state of Washington, bison are coming back just outside Spokane. Those bison are actually being moved from the Bison Range here in Montana to the Kalispel tribe outside Spokane. And so there's places you can go visit returning bison in the state of Washington and further to the west, which is not naturally such prolific bison habitat, but certainly there's cultural connections there to the bison.
If you had one book title to suggest, does anything come to mind immediately on this topic?
On bison, Steve Rinella wrote a pretty good book.
There's a question from Ella that follows on a sort of question that came up in my mind too. Do you think it's possible for us effectively to coexist with these animals like deer and like bears moving into the city? And if so, how? And how will that change? How could that change the animals, I guess, is a question too.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, on the one hand, total unfettered coexistence is impossible, right? You're not likely to have grizzly bears back in Denver, for example. So on the one hand, one has to be realistic about what coexistence means. But on the other hand, I think we can tolerate more coexistence than perhaps we expect.
Right.
With a little bit of etiquette on our part. And I think of a highway overpass or an underpass as an etiquette. It's a way of being polite to the animals and say, yeah, we've put this road here because we need to get to work, but we understand that you need to get to where the berry crop is too. So we'll do this bit for you and you do this bit for us. And I think a striking example of coexistence is in Europe, where wolves have sort of shown up in the unlikeliest places. I mean, the Netherlands is one of the most densely populated countries in the world. It doesn't have vast wilderness areas, but the wolves find scraps of forest. They find places where there aren't too many people, and they find a way to make it work. I mean, think of in Los Angeles, P22, that cougar that lived in the Beverly Hills for 10 years.
Right.
And it lived in the Beverly Hills for 10 years and put on weight whilst it was living there. And for 10 years, until it got old and kind of long in the tooth, people didn't see it. It didn't bother anybody. It just lived there and did its cougar thing. And then as it got older, it started to show up a bit more because it became a less good a hunter. So I think coexistence, it takes energy, effort, creativity, but I think it's more possible perhaps than we imagine. And I think of the British are still worried that lynxes are going to eat their children. The imaginary about lynx in the UK is still so far away from the reality of what it would be to live around lynx. And I think that there's always stuff to learn to adjust one's conception of animals to something that matches what the animal actually is.
Thanks, Christopher. A couple of quick things. One is, you haven't mentioned this word, but I think about it a lot, and I feel like it's relevant here, is humility. This changed relationship requires humans to embrace, along with compassion, humility. And that opens a lot of opportunities, I think. I think we're getting close to winding down. I want to do one more question, and it comes from a gentleman named John. He's just been kayaking in the Salmon River, and in thinking a lot and talking with others about the salmon, that river, the dams downstream. His question is, can you suggest how to engage and support people who fear losses or threats from rewilding and have no experience or confidence in the benefits? This is really, I feel like, embedded throughout the book. And I think it's a great question. It'd be interesting to have you sort of, reflect on that.
Yeah, no, it is a terrific question. And I've got to be really careful. Like if I come out here and just start gushing about wolves in Europe and bison in North America and black bears and, you name it, any town in the Western United States, it can be insensitive. It can be insensitive to people that have genuine concerns and economic concerns. One line that somebody used when I was interviewing for an article that I just came out a couple of weeks ago in Sierra magazine. It's called Good Neighbors, and it's about how to get along with grizzly bears as they expand their range. I asked Lisa Upson, who works for People and Carnivores. So People and Carnivores is a Montana organization that helps with coexistence. I said, do you think your work is changing people's values? Do you set out to change people's values about bears and wolves and lions and so forth? And she says, no. She says, I don't set out to change people's values. I set out to give people options. And she said, if you give people options, that gives them the chance to think differently about things. And I thought that was very astute, that if somebody fears the arrival of a new animal on a landscape, if you can show real options, here's a way that this challenge can be managed. And to the extent that the challenge can't be managed, here's a way that we're going to compensate you for the losses that you might incur. I think that is a promising start. And that sort of begins with respect and dialogue and taking people's concerns seriously. And luckily, there's a lot of good people engaged in that work right now, because that's tremendously important work. It's no good just to sit in a town like Missoula, as I do, and imagine this is easy for everybody, because it's clearly people have different things at stake in the return of wildlife, and it's very important to be sensitive to those different things.
Thanks. You did write a book that has been widely published and read and is helping contribute to the conversation. So thank you for that. Before we sign off for the evening, there's two things I want to highlight, and I'll just introduce quickly. One is asking everyone here to sign this petition. The Bonneville Power Administration, the federal agency that markets federal power from the Columbia Basin dams, is attempting to evade its long-standing and undisputed public responsibilities to recover salmon and steelhead that are harmed by dams in the Columbia and Snake Rivers, that are required by the Power Act that was passed back in 1980. They've decided that we shouldn't have numeric recovery goals, and they've decided that if those are maintained, they've been around for about 5 million fish every year, returning adults, that if those numbers are retained, it should be explicit that they don't have responsibilities to contribute to that. So we're calling on the Northwest Power and Planning Council, which is a regional 4-state body that was also created by the Power Act of 1980, to make sure that they represent our region and our values, economic, ecological, cultural, spiritual, to recover these iconic Northwest fish. So sign the petition. It delivers a strong message to the council, who is in the process of assessing a bunch of recommendations, including those from Bonneville Power Administration, about what the Fish and Wildlife Program for our region and in the Columbia Basin in particular needs to prioritize. So we're working hard to generate as many as 5,000 signatures from around the region to deliver them in the next couple of weeks. So if you could sign that, that would be wonderful. If you can share it with people that would be interested in signing it, that would also be greatly appreciated. That's the first action. The second is to encourage you to attend Save Our Wild Salmon, Hear the People, Heal the River Action Hour. Help us move forward on salmon recovery with a particular focus on the Pacific Northwest, regional leadership now, in particular because things at the national level are so challenging and antagonistic. I do think we have some real opportunities in this hard time in the Pacific Northwest. The Power Council is one, members of Congress is another, governors of the Northwest or other important actors who can really help defend and lead at a hard time. Christopher, tremendous appreciation and gratitude for leading the conversation this evening, for writing the book, for sharing your thoughts and ideas, and I think helping to advance this conversation about our relationship here with other critters and with each other and the place we live in. So I don't know. I want to give you a chance to make any sort of final or concluding remarks, and then we'll wrap up.
I just say thanks for inviting me, and keep up the fantastic work that you're doing. Salmon are important. They're the lifeblood of the region, and we want to see them flourish.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you all for attending. It's an honor to have you spend the evening with us. We're available at any time. You reach out. We'd love to hear from you, help engage you, answer questions, and work together. Have a great evening. Thank you so much.